Through the power and the wonder of the internet, we're going to be speaking to Assistant Professor Nathan Schneider, live from the University of Colorado Boulder. But Nathan is actually at home, and in the great interests of equity, he's looking after the kids tonight. So you'll also just be very aware that he's multitasking. After Nathan's address, we'll spend about 20 or so minutes with Nathan online. We're going to go straight into a wonderful panel, our Business Leaders in Conversation series we've been running for the last few years with our wonderful facilitator, Peter Ryan. So a little bit about Nathan. He is, as I said, the Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He leads the Media Economies Design Lab and an MA program in Media and Public Engagement. He's the author of Everything for Everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy, and I really encourage you to read his works. He does write very expansively about the role of cooperatives and mutuals in the new economy, particularly the rise of the platform economy and how cooperatives can play a very impactful role in terms of democratising that and making sure that tech works in the interests of the many, not the few. So without further ado, we're handing over to Nathan. I hope you can hear us loud and clear, Nathan.
Beautifully, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you, at least in this way. I'm sorry I am not there in a physical capacity, but family commitments and the academic calendar didn't make that possible. I'm still reveling though in the experience I had some years ago there in Australia and learned so much about the sector as it is and the hopes for the future. I hope this this talk is useful, and again, it's such a pleasure to be with you. So I want to begin with a little thought experiment. We won. The cooperative commonwealth is here. The majority of businesses, or maybe a plurality at least, are co-ops and mutuals. We did it. Great job. But now what? What is it like to live in this kind of world? In particular, what is it like to co-govern this kind of world? Which of the many possible annual meetings will you go to? The annual meeting for your job or your supermarket or your daycare or your insurance company? Will co-ops be competing with each other to check their participation boxes to maximize the number of people showing up at their annual meeting as opposed to the other annual meeting? This victory could be a kind of nightmare if we're not careful. This revolution hasn't happened yet, but already many of us probably feel some of the limits of our capacities for participation. And many of us have experienced some of the agonies of that participation, of how difficult democratic life can be when it demands so much of us. This talk is an exploration of how we could prepare ourselves for this cooperative commonwealth and think about our governance practices in ways that help us ask the right things of our members and of our organizations, and to think about democracy as a kind of economy, and to recognize that in any economy, there are many different forms and many different kinds of involvement. So I come to this question as a media scholar, as someone who's thinking in particular about the context of the online economy. And one concept that has become, became prominent with the early development of the internet was this idea of attention economies. It was drawing particularly on the cyberneticist Herbert Simon, some utterances in the 70s, recognizing that if this computer thing took off, attention would become a scarce resource. And as we, I think, all know in our intimate daily lives, that prediction has absolutely become true. And so many thinkers exploring the online economy and practitioners, people building the leading platforms that we all use every day, are thinking about attention as an economy. And they're recognizing the need to carefully design their digital interfaces around attention, that the guidance of attention is a crucial art, something that can make or break the fortunes of a platform, a company, a technology. And I think this is an important insight that we need to recognize in the context of governance. Now, of course, in much of the online economy, governance is not actually an option. You don't get to vote unless you're a shareholder, right? But most users are not voting at the Facebook or Meta annual meeting. They're not voting about the admins in their subreddits. We don't do the kind of governance in online space often that we do in our cooperatives and mutuals. But I think a lot of the same ideas actually apply, and that thinking more intentionally about attention can help us develop a healthier set of expectations about how governance and participation should work in our organizations. And this is something that I'm sure many of you do already, whether you've intentionally named it or not in terms of attention. For instance, bringing food to an annual meeting, as a way of rewarding the time and attention that people bring to it. And it raises that question of whether the cost benefit of that attention is working out for the people who are involved. So there's something very intuitive about this concept, but at the same time, I think a lot of us don't think really holistically about what our expectations could and should be, both for our organizations and for our broader ecosystem, recognizing that we want our members to be part of many different kinds of organizations, not just ours. Here's Herbert Simon here with this prediction describing how a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And I think similarly, a wealth of governance opportunities creates at least the danger of a poverty of attention, of a kind of dystopia that we want to avoid. Now, cooperators love categorizing. You might have noticed. Sometimes they ask, what is a real co-op or mutual? What really counts as someone genuinely practicing the 7 principles? Another way that we like to categorize is what stakeholder category is a given co-op? Is it a worker co-op? Is it a consumer co-op? Is it a producer co-op? We have lots and lots of ways of dividing ourselves and subdividing. And in some respects, the question that I'm asking here invites you to throw a lot of those categories away, because these questions cut across all of those categories and invite us to think about different ways of organizing and classifying the different kinds of organizations we might represent. Not every democratic organization needs to be high touch. We need many different kinds of mutualist enterprises, and each will have different kinds of expectations for its stakeholders. I think of this in my own life, in the kinds of cooperatives that I and people around me have been part of. For instance, the company that my wife works for, she got involved with because once she was a member of the Park Slope Food Co-op in New York. And she, like every member, was obligated to work at the co-op from time to time to contribute labor, not just money. And that it's a high cost commitment, but it resulted in one day her cutting cheese with the man who is now her boss. It opens the door for these kind of intensive relationships, these intensive experiences through the attention that that this high-touch co-op obligates its members to. Another example, for instance, in my case, is my regional credit union. It's the largest mortgage lender in the region. It's a very successful credit union. It has the mortgage for my house. And I have zero financial acumen and like to avoid spreadsheets at all costs. I really appreciate that it does not require me to sit in the basement cutting cheese or whatever the financial equivalent of that is. It's not an organization I especially want to be intensely part of. But at the same time, I have taken time to meet with board members of the organization. I've taken time to understand who's representing me, not to get into the mix of it, but just to understand what they're up to. And it's a very different kind of cooperative. It's something I still think of myself as involved in and supportive of, but the relationship is totally different. And I think that's for the best. Now, this is not something, a kind of question that you can think of in kind of one-dimensional terms. When we think about involvement economies, this is going to differ for different kinds of stakeholders, whether you're thinking about employees or consumer members, or even different kinds of consumer members. There are going to be different expectations of involvement. And I think it's really worth what I'm arguing for you today is that we need to do better about setting our expectations and making those expectations really, really clear to members. Because often you see problems arising in our organizations through a lack of clarity about what is expected and appropriate for different kinds of stakeholders. What kind of attention is involved? A lot of times, for instance, at that Park Slope Food Co-op, you have people who seem to think that despite being one of many, many, many thousands of members, that if their voice isn't heard and acted on, everything should fall apart, or that it's not truly democratic. At the same time, sometimes I think my credit union could do a better job helping its members understand that even though they're not directly involved day to day, this is a democratic organization, and that there are specific points in which we can be involved in that democratic life. So I'm not going to let you off the hook here. One version of this story could be it's okay to not have to not be practicing a lot of these democratic participation, these expectations of democratic participation that are built into the cooperative principles. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think by and large, a lot of our more established co-ops actually need to revive and deepen their democratic practices, but in the right ways. The goal here is not to give you permission not to involve members, but it's about finding those right ways and making sure that that expectation is clear both within your organization, among employees who are leading it, and among the members, whoever they may be. Now, there's another dimension I want to bring to this conversation beyond just that question of economy. And that's the question about what kind of participation we're talking about. And this is another lesson from the online economy, because this is something that those big tech startups are beating us at. And this really should be our own game. The whole business of social media and the gig economy is built on the practice of lateral connections. Lateral connections among users, peer-to-peer, doing things together, and often forming relationships in the process, or building even on existing relationships. That's what makes Meta one of the most valuable companies in the world, because of its social graph, because of the way it has data on relationships of people all over the world. Now, when you think back to the origins of the credit union or cooperative bank system or the mutual insurance systems, this is what they were built on: lateral relationships. The Desjardins system in Canada, that was the beginning of the credit union movement here in North America, grew out of church parishes where people knew each other. The problem at the time was that the larger capitalist banks didn't know how to decide which little poor people they could lend money to. Yet those people in their communities knew who was trustworthy. It was that lateral relationship that was the competitive advantage and unlocked the possibility of all that the credit union system has become. Now, fast forward to the present, and I've been in rooms with executives of credit unions across North America talking about their members. And it's really a fascinating thing to hear, because on the one hand, I've heard really wonderful commitments of, devotion and commitment to the well-being of members in a way that I would find hard to imagine hearing at a lot of investor-owned banks. So that's very powerful. At the same time, one thing I have never heard in those contexts is the lateral relationships. The question is always, what is my relationship to my member, right? As if the organization is just a kind of sun with rays all scattered one-to-one to its members. So rarely do we ask the question of what are our members doing for each other? How can we enable those lateral relationships that have actually been our superpower in the past, the very reason for being of many kinds of cooperatives, particularly in financial sectors, but in no way limited to that. And so when we talk about economies of attention, this difference between the lateral and the vertical is another question to introduce. Are we enabling people to build those relationships and spread that attention more widely, or do we have to manage that attention at every point? The reason that my wife got the job that she did was not because the credit or the co-op introduced her, knew that she and her future boss had some common interests. It was because it trusted them to sit together at a table, cutting cheese and to find the unexpected possibilities that might emerge from that. Are there ways that you in your community could cultivate a healthier attention economy by actually intentionally enabling those lateral relationships, not just the vertical ones between you and your members? For instance, some experiments I've seen on this front are cases like credit unions starting to create mini credit unions within themselves at the level of small communities, a kind of virtual credit union where the legal entity is still, the larger institution, but the experience that individual members have is much more based on that small community. In this, I kind of invite us to ask, what would Desjardins do? What would the founders of the credit, the organizations that you lead do today? And so often our organizations in the cooperative and mutual movement have been built on these lateral relationships that so often are missing and have actually just been kind of co-opted by investor-owned tech platforms that understand the power of lateral relationships, of trusting users to do things together, even if it can get messy sometimes. And as a result, we're losing what should be, our core competency. You can even put these questions that I've been posing on a chart all together. You can think about, for each of the different stakeholders in your organizations, where are vertical relationships the only kind of thing you see, and where are the lateral ones happening? Lateral relationships might occur in the office, but maybe don't occur between people between members themselves. Those might just be vertical with the people in the offices. We might think about high involvement and low involvement. Who are we expecting to have high involvement, and how can we make sure to communicate that and reward that involvement appropriately. At the same time, who are we expecting, should have low involvement? Why does that make sense? How can we tell that story and communicate it to them while also explaining how democratic participation is still part of what that lower involvement can look like? So walk through the different stakeholders in your organization and think about where they are right now and where they should be. Where is the right kind of niche for them in the attention economy of the system as a whole? So this is an invitation to design for where involvement matters most, to design in ways where you're using people's attention best. And sometimes that involves trusting them, not just to direct their attention to you and you to direct your attention to them, but to recognize that through lateral relationships, that attention economy can be more fulfilling and more vibrant, where people directing their co-governing and participation attention to each other can actually enable them to find the whole experience more rewarding and to place fewer demands on what is probably a staff that's stretched thin. Finally, I invite you to enter into that thought experiment that I started with. What would it look like if every organization that your members were engaged with was also a cooperative and mutual? And what kind of niche would you expect and want your organization to have in their lives? Design for that future, and maybe it'll help us get there. Thank you so much. I hope this is useful. Please feel free to be in touch with me if there's anything you want to follow up on. Again, I appreciate so much the opportunity to join you today.